de Janeiro. Gautam Roy getting us the latest from the developments at the G20 in Brazil. Taking forward the conversation, India at the G20, I'm joined by two eminent guests. Let me welcome Ambassador Mohan Kumar, former senior diplomat. Also joining me in the studio is Dr. Sandipani Das, Professor, Department of African Studies, University of Delhi. Good evening and welcome, gentlemen. Ambassador Kumar, if I can come to you first. Look at the theme of the G20 Brazil this year, building a just world and a sustainable planet. It sounds very ambitious given the kind of geopolitical developments that we are looking at today. How well has the issue been able to address, and what has been achieved according to you so far in the engagement, sir?
Thank you very much for having me. I think I'll begin by saying that Brazil finds the international circumstances slightly more favorable than Delhi, than India, when we conducted the G20. When we conducted the G20 summit, the geopolitical tensions were much more serious and so on. Now, President Trump has been elected. It's clear and certain that Ukraine, for example, there will be a diplomatic solution sooner or later. So that's the first point I will make. The second point I will make is that the Rio leaders' declaration has borrowed quite heavily from the Delhi summit declaration. In fact, the paragraph on Ukraine is almost word by word the same. And they openly, explicitly accept that they referred to the discussions on Ukraine in New Delhi declaration. There is also an acknowledgement that Delhi summit and the Indian presidency has done a lot of work on the reform of multilateral development banks and so on. So I would say that the Brazilian Rio declaration is really a follow-up of the Indian G20 summit or the New Delhi declaration in that sense. Having said that, Brazil, as you rightly said, wanted to focus on three things. One, President Lula was particularly attached to the idea of the fight against hunger and poverty because of his own background, because of the kind of issues that he had to face when he was young. So he took it very, very personally. The second, of course, is that you should not forget Rio was the birthplace of the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment. So Rio in many ways is the birthplace of sustainable development. So it's very fitting that Brazil wanted to focus on the issue of sustainable development and climate. The third thing that the Brazilians wanted to focus was on reforming global governance, global institutions. I would say these were the three. And I would say that if you ask me very frankly the kind of progress made, I would have to say to you that the glass is half full. For example, Lula in his statement said the fact that we have so much of food grains available in the world, he says any one person going hungry in the world should be unacceptable because the world has enough food to feed the entire population of the world. So the problem is something else. It is distribution, it is purchasing power, the existence of very stubborn poverty in areas. So the global alliance against hunger and poverty is, I think, the main achievement, but it remains to be seen how this will be taken forward. On climate, I would have to tell you very frankly that climate negotiators now meeting in Baku in Azerbaijan are somewhat disappointed that the G20 has not been able to give them a figure. There is a new collective global quantification of the amount that is needed to fight climate change. The $100 billion per year has now been achieved, but that is grossly insufficient. We need trillion or more dollars. That figure has not been supplied by the G20 to the climate negotiators in Baku. The G20 has merely wished the Baku summit well and has urged the negotiators to take things forward. On the reform of global governance, I think I find India and Brazil exactly on the same page. They have appealed for a reform of the UN Security Council. They have appealed for a reform of the WTO, and they have appealed for a reform of the IMF and the World Bank. But some would say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When will this reform happen? Because G20 summit after summit has been talking about reform of the Security Council, reform of the WTO, and so on, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So in that sense, to answer your question very briefly, Shubhendra, I would say the glass is half full, but I see this summit. It is explicitly said a few things that it owes to the Delhi summit, but I think it's a takeoff from the Delhi summit, and Brazilians have been successful in taking things forward. In the kind of world we live in today, I think a consensus declaration is not a mean achievement. So we should all welcome the Rio G20 summit declaration.
Right, Ambassador Kumar, the point that you mentioned about G20's call for reforms that have of the global institutions that have gone unheard. Thus, let me take that point to Dr. Dash. Your key takeaways from the summit this year, sir, and the point about reforms, although the G20 has been able to reform itself from the inside. African Union joins the G20 as a full member this time over. There are 21 participants. How do you look at this edition in that context, sir?
Yeah, thanks, Sovendu. I think it's a marker development of African Union is part of G20, and that really brings quality to the G20. First, let me share you what's my understanding of G20. G20 is not mere a talking forum, it's a working forum. Why? Because it's a forum of the dominant emergent powers as well as the emerging powers. And if the emerging powers are represented by Delhi, Modi from Delhi and now Lula from Rio de Janeiro, so Modi has got a very clear, kind of achievement list that we brought African Union. It's not we're speaking about it. So it's like you galvanize the forum, and you also bringing in all these emerging voices. And second point is that this declaration of a shared space of G20 in New Delhi, like one, kind of one family, one future, and all stuff. And now this Lula is talking about mainstreaming the voiceless in the international forum. So in that way, it's a forward match. And at the same time also, Modi is talking about it's not only my achievement records that financial and development inclusions domestically and globally, whether it's a food security, whether it is a financial capacity building, but also I'm giving you the message that back to the basics. That means basics of food, basics of shelters and all stuff that has to be looked into, and also march to the forward. The forward march is a very sustainable and clean future, and that has to be happen orchestrated in a very kind of joint and collaborative method of the emerged and emerging powers, or so to speak, developed and developing countries, emerging powers. So in that way, it makes quite a substantial sense when Modi and Lula is there talking about. And the third thing I'm talking about, when you mentioned about this food, hunger and conflict and global governance, they're just not mere three kind of separate things. They are very interrelated to each other, because if you have a conflict, that leads to hunger, and conflict is there because we fail to govern globally in the manner that we should have, and that's also shared experiences. So in that way, if Lula's background, as the esteemed ambassador said, it's a very kind of forceful voice, then Modi's background, he is a delivery man. He delivers domestically and also globally. So in that way, so it's not only about kind of moral appeal, or also appeal for the people's concern, but act. And so this is the way you can move ahead. That's a march to forward, along with the back to basics.
Right. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, the centerpiece so far, the Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, that has been deliberated at the G20 Rio Declaration. How do you see also India's action and vision in this regard? You did mention about the resonance between the New Delhi Declaration and what has been agreed upon in Rio de Janeiro. India lifting 250 million people out of extreme multidimensional poverty. Those experiences also become significant on a platform like this?
Absolutely. And I think I share Professor Dash, whatever he said about what Prime Minister Modi has done within the country and outside. But our own experience of the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, where we, I think, have something like 800 million people who get either free or highly subsidized food grains and lentils every month. And mind you, this program has now been extended to December 2028. So I think that is the real substitute, if you like, for a social safety net that we don't have in India. But the fact that we have this, and the fact that we are going to have a health insurance scheme which covers 550 million people is, I think, significant. But the bottom line is, if something can work in India and Brazil, then I think it can work anywhere in the world. The problem today is the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal number 1, is no hunger, and Sustainable Development 2 is no poverty. And these two goals are supposed to be achieved by 2030. But the Secretary General of the UN has said that only 17% of the SDGs have been achieved by 2023. And this is more than halfway. So the SDG goals are completely off track. And this is what the Brazilian president and the Indian prime minister have been emphasizing, that without achieving the SDG goals number 1 and 2, you really are not doing justice to developing countries and least developed countries. And since Brazil is focused so much on hunger and poverty, which is SDG goal number 1 and SDG goal number 2, without achieving those, the whole SDG agenda falls on the wayside. What is the problem with achieving those goals? Pure and simply, it is lack of resources. You need money. Developed countries have not been able to fulfill their goal of transferring 0.70% of their gross national income to developing and least developed countries. This is a goal that was established by UNCTAD in 1970, and we now have given them 50 years to achieve it. Similarly, you need finance for climate change, climate finance. So frankly, it boils down to the political will that rich countries must have towards lesser rich countries or poor countries, and the fact that you need to find funds. So those really are the main focus issues, if you like, in the Rio summit.
Right. And alongside Ambassador Kumar, the G20 Rio Declaration also investigates and talks about what will ensure tackling hunger and poverty in a sustainable manner. It talks about condemnation of wars, calls for peace. And another point that you mentioned, you talked about rich countries, but it is also talking about the rich and the poor divide and the need to tax the rich to make sure that it can be a more egalitarian society. Those themes also hugely important. After the pandemic, we see these conflicts really taking in most of the resources of the regions, and poverty and hunger is what most parts of the world is left with.
No, hugely important, because I think the Rio Declaration makes a reference to both inequality within countries,
yes,
and inequality between countries, and both are growing. And this is a matter of huge concern. Lula has been extremely attached, Brazil has been attached to the idea of taxing ultra-rich, high net worth individuals. You know, we've heard the expression high net worth individuals, but Brazil and the Rio Declaration is talking about ultra high net worth individuals, which presumably means people with assets of $1 billion and more. And there are not too many. We have maybe in thousands. And Brazil has long argued for a tax on these people. But you will recall that in Rio, we had the Argentinian president who was objecting to this. Finally, they have come up with a compromise which says, without prejudice to tax sovereignty. Then they have gone on to say that we must look at the possibility of taxing ultra high net worth individuals, either to finance SDGs or to finance climate change. So you're quite right. Inequality within countries, climate finance, and the possibility of taxing ultra high net individuals so that you can find the money to actually make people's lives better in poorer countries.
Right. Dr. Dash, I'll come to you. And again, in the context of African Union, them being the newest member of the G20, how do these themes of hunger, poverty, sustainable development, more egalitarian taxation, how do these work with Africa and African Union? How do they resonate with these themes?
I think they have a substantial stake in the issues that we are talking about, is with hunger, with sustainability of development, and so on and so forth. And because and this is not only these African members of the countries of African member countries have suffered or also subjected to hunger and deprivations, but also they have unfortunately witnessed a very prolonged kind of conflicts, and also they are also victims of the ill governance at the global forum. So in that way, this African Union as a kind of continent.
And so particularly the disparity that Ambassador Kumar was talking about between rich and the poor countries.
Yeah.
And to close that gap, in that context, how significant is the engagement with the African Union?
Yeah, it will be very significant in the sense that you have the African Union is not a very kind of uniform grouping. It has the fastest growing economies, and also quite many countries with need assistance and also need handholding. So in that way, so this shading is not only at the global scale, but it also shared at regional and also kind of country level. In that way, African unions be part of G20, and then talking about how you have a financially and also kind of logistically inclusive mechanism, so that your kind of issues can be shared. And then what is more important here, this African Union, or for that matter India and Brazil, it's not merely about the financial kind of restructuring. It's about the global mechanism of acting on the issues that we're talking about, with hunger or kind of system of conflicts, or for global governance. Because if you don't act, if you don't kind of live up to your promises, then you have that parallel kind of plurilateral setups. Now you have in that G20 forum itself, you have trilateral this kind of troika kind of groupings. So in that way, it's there is a kind of urgency, and also there is a kind of inability on the part of the developed countries to come to the terms on operational level, or else that's the reason why I told that G20 is not just a talking forum, it's a working forum. And let me tell you once again, G20 is the nucleus of the global affairs today, because you have the kind of emerged and emerging countries that together. And now with the African Union and India is kind of making the umbrella wide of the G20, so it's becoming more a viable global forum.
Right. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, I'm eager to also be able to address the elephant in the room, as it were. The President-elect of the United States, Donald Trump, the kind of worldview that he has in the ecosystem of his thoughts, how do these pro-poor, pro-planet reforms appear? And a couple of months from now, he's going to be leading the most powerful economy in the world. In that sense, the commitments that President Biden's government makes here at this G20, how far will they be able to fulfill that? I mean, how do you see this complication here?
So it's interesting you asked me that question, and I'm so happy you asked this question. I was hesitating to make the point myself. But let me begin by saying that the G20 summit declaration, leaders' declaration from Rio, reads as if President Trump was never elected. So the first point I will make is they have decided, forget about President Trump for a minute. We will deal with whoever represents America here. And so I'll give you an example. If you look at the paragraph on the Gaza conflict, it talks of expanding humanitarian aid. It talks of emergency assistance. It talks of putting an end to the war. Now, we all know that while President Trump is viscerally opposed to the war, either in Ukraine or in Gaza, but he is basically well inclined towards Israel. And he basically tells Israel, finish the job that you were about to embark on. Only thing is, finish it before I take office. That's the message he has conveyed to Israel. Similarly, the Rio Summit Declaration talks of reiteration of commitment of the Paris Climate Change Accord goals of keeping global warming compared to pre-industrial times to even less than 1.5%. Now, it's well known that President Trump may very well become the president of the United States and get out of the Paris Accord, as he did last time. In which case, your entire chapter on climate goes for a 6. But I don't think the Rio summit leaders have bothered too much about it, and you can't blame them because he is not there. We don't know what he's going to say. It is well known that President Trump is extremely unpredictable. So what do? You have to play with the hand you are dealt with. And the hand you are dealt with is lame duck President Biden. So we try to make the best of it. The other thing I can honestly tell you is that the next time round, if you have President Trump attending the G20 summit, even a consensus declaration is going to be difficult. Because you remember in Italy once, or in Germany, I can't remember, there was a G20 declaration which said it is G20 minus 1, when President Trump did not accept the final declaration. This can happen again. So in many ways, the frank answer to your question is the leaders have decided not to see the elephant in the room. They have said, okay, we will deal with it when he comes. Who knows, he may change his mind. We will deal with President Biden. He may be lame duck, but it is still the official delegation of the United States of America. And therefore, they've gone ahead with many of these things. But you are absolutely right. Some of these things, I suspect, will have to be revisited when President Trump attends a G20 summit next year.
Right. Let's